What's going on, guys? Landon with LateModelRestoration.com. Today we're going to be checking out Eibach Pro-Kit lowering springs for all 2015 Mustangs. Every Eibach spring kit is designed and tested by a suspension engineer and performance driving professional to offer aggressive looks and high performance handling. The Pro-Kit will rid that ugly factory wheel gap and lower your 2015 Mustang approximately 1 inch in the front and 3/4 of an inch in the rear. These lowering springs feature a specific rate for a firmer ride and will fit all 2015 EcoBoost, V6, and 5.0 Mustangs. The kit will also include new bump stops and front dust boots. We measured the factory springs from the ground to the top of the fender, and the result was 28.5 inches for the front and rear. Now let's go ahead and show you how to install the Eibach Pro-Kit lowering springs onto your 2015 Mustang. Begin by placing the car on a lift or jacking it up and placing it on jack stands. Remove the factory lug nuts with a 21mm socket and then remove the wheel. To remove the front strut, start by removing the brake caliper. This is held on by two 15mm bolts. Once removed, you can set the caliper on the rear of the K-member. Then go ahead and remove the brake rotor and set it aside. Remove the two push-pin clips that route the ABS wire to the ABS sensor. To remove the strut, use a 21mm open-end wrench for the bolt and a 24mm socket for the nut. Loosen both nuts, but do not completely remove them. The strut bolts are splined, so you will have to tap them out with a hammer. Once you have tapped the bolts loose, go ahead and remove the nuts. Next, loosen the 3 strut tower bolts with a 16mm socket, but don't completely remove the nuts. Tap the strut bolts out and then remove the sway bar end-link nut with a 17mm open-end wrench and the 18mm deep socket. Then remove the strut tower nuts, the sway bar end-link, and remove the strut from the car. With a set of spring compressors, compress the factory spring. Make sure each spring compressor is placed on the opposite side of one another and compress each side of the spring, alternating back and forth until the bottom of the spring starts to separate from the isolator. Then remove the small thread cover from the top of the strut and remove the strut mount bolt with a 21mm socket. From there, remove the strut mount and isolator, and then slide the spring and dust boot off of the strut. Be sure and remove your spring compressors from the factory springs. Using the supplied dust boots and bump stops, slide the white bump stop into the dust boot with the flat end facing up toward the top of the strut. Then slide the new bump stop and dust boot over the strut. With the Eibach logo facing up, align the bottom pigtail with the isolator and compress the new spring. Align the top pigtail of the new spring with the isolator, reinstall your strut mount, and loosely tighten the 21mm nut. Remember to remove your spring compressor from your new Eibach spring. To reinstall the front strut, start by sliding the strut mount bolts through the strut tower and loosely tighten the 3 nuts. Slide the strut bolts through the strut and tighten those as well. Reattach your ABS wiring clips. Reinstall your sway bar end link and tighten it down. And then go back on with your brake rotor and caliper. Fully tighten down the 3 strut tower nuts, the strut mount nut, and then reinstall your thread cover. Complete the same steps for the other side. To remove the rear springs, start by placing a jack under the IRS subframe. Fully remove the 2 subframe bolts with a 22mm socket and partially remove the front subframe bracket bolts with a 13mm socket. Since we are essentially dropping the IRS subframe, remove the brake line bracket with a 13mm socket so it has some wiggle room. Remove the 2 bolts that hold the rear shock mount to the chassis with an 18mm socket. If needed, lower your jack down some to give you a little more room to remove the rear spring. Pull down on the lower control arm a tad and remove the rear spring. With the spring removed, take off the plastic thread cover from the top of the shock and remove the shock mount nut with a 15mm socket. Slide off the dust boot and factory bump stop. With the supplied yellow bump stop, slide it over the shock with the flat side facing up. Then, slide the factory dust boot over the new bump stop. Next, install the new Eibach spring and make sure both the top and bottom isolators are lined with their spring pigtails. Jack up the IRS subframe and reinstall the shock mount nut, and plastic thread cover. Reinstall the brake line bracket and jack up the IRS subframe until you can align it with the bolt holes in the bottom of the chassis. Tighten down the 2 subframe to chassis bolts and the 2 bolts on the front subframe bracket. Do the same for the other side, and you're done. Installation should take you about 2 to 3 hours if you're working off of jack stands and about an hour to an hour and a half on a lift. After installation, we remeasured from the ground to the top of the fender and achieved 27.5 inches in the front and 28 inches in the rear. Those results are good for an inch drop up front and a 1/2 inch out back. For more 2015 Mustang how-tos, subscribe to our YouTube channel and of course, pick up your Eibach lowering springs from LateModelRestoration.com.